Victorian Literature and Science. In 19th century periodicals, magazines and newspapers such as the Westminster Review and Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, scientific issues were set side by side with fiction, poetry and literary criticism. Thus, in the popular press, literature and science became inextricably linked, with scientists quoting poets and authors of fiction continuing to explore the implications of new scientific theories. By making frequent references to fiction and poetry, men of science were able to demonstrate a depth of reading and skill in writing, which won the confidence of the reading public. The first Viscount John Morley, 1838 to 1923, observed that by the 1870s, evolutionary discourse had passed from the laboratory and study to the parlour, to be debated by barbers, butlers and dockers, vapid women, and men on omnibuses with little or no knowledge of Darwin, Spencer or Huxley. The novelist and populariser of science, Grant Allen, decried the ubiquitous nature of evolution. In 1888, Allen lamented in the Cornhill magazine, "It pervades society everywhere with its subtle essence. It infects small talk with its familiar catchwords and its slang phrases. Everybody believes he knows all about it and discusses it glibly in his everyday conversation." By the same token, this trafficking in ideas also worked to the advantage of artists, poets and writers of fiction, for the influence of scientific discoveries was integral to the works of Tennyson, Dickens, Ruskin, Charles Kingsley and George Eliot, among others. Literature may even have helped to shape the development of science by actively participating in its popularization and cultural construction. Literature and astronomy in particular are inextricably linked in human thought and activity. And here we have a quote from Pamela Gostin, who has written on Hardy, told you I'd get him in there. "Poets, novelists, dramatists, essayists, natural philosophers, astronomers and physicists, through history, combined literary and astronomical approaches to understanding and communicating knowledge about the phenomena of the cosmos and our human relation to it." There are numerous examples of this dialogue between literature and science, from Coleridge's discussion of cosmology in Religious Musings and Shelley's treatment of the Earth-Moon system in Prometheus Unbound, to Tennyson's integration of cosmology and evolutionary theory in Memoriam, and George Meredith's optimistic exploration of ethical and aesthetic responses to the possibility that humanity shares its origin with the inorganic star in Meditation Under Stars. And of course, there is Thomas Hardy, woohoo, particularly in his novel Two on a Tower, discussing various aspects of astronomy through the character of Swithin St. Cleeve. However, not all literary figures embraced science or Darwinism. Robert Browning's Caliban upon Setebos of 1864 is an example of how unsettling Darwinism can be if given serious thought. And writers such as Christina Rossetti and Gerard Manley Hopkins saw Darwinism as a threat to be faced down through an affirmation of the incarnation of Christ and the truth of the revealed word. Whether scientific discourse was welcomed or reviled, from such appropriations we begin to see how evolutionary and biological constructions of gender and society in literature were becoming an increasingly significant in the 19th century. Gillian Beer's book, Darwin's Plots, originally 1985, but revised and updated in 2009, reads The Origin of Species and the Descent of Man as literary texts, rather than as strictly scientific texts. She explores the theory of evolution as a narrative in Darwin's writings, and she goes on to apply this critical technique to certain novels by George Eliot and Thomas Hardy. She states that an understanding of the traditional topics of many 19th century novels, such as courtship, sensibility, the making of matches, women's beauty, men's dominance, and inheritance in all of its forms, become much more difficult in the wake of the publication of The Descent of Man. For both Hardy and Eliot in particular, the social, psychological, and biological contradictions inherent in the man-woman relationship and the identification with genetic succession became crucial to the rereading of a novel's topics. For these authors and many others, including George Gissing and George Meredith, the discordance between a woman's individuality and her conventional progenerative role had now become greatly emphasised. Gillian Beer cites Hardy's novel Tess of the D'Urbervilles as an example, but this discordance is equally applicable to the complex portrayals of femininity exhibited by characters of Bathsheba Everdeen in Far From the Madding Crowd, Grace Melbury in The Woodlanders, and Sue Bridehead in Jude the Obscure. These novels contain the narratives of women who attempt to subvert the roles ascribed to them by the accepted conventions of their society and the consequences of such actions. It must be remembered, though, that femininity of these particular characters is defined against and in relation to the masculinity of the male characters of these novels, which in turn has been shaped by the dictates of natural selection and sexual selection as described by Darwin. As Beer notes, the role of women both as vessels of continuity, bearing children, handing on the inheritance of the race, and as representing what men in a specific culture most desire, was now foregrounded by a new emphasis on selection. The influence of evolutionary theory upon the understanding of gender as sexual construct was no greater than the impact of Darwinism on consideration of race and ethnicity. Prior to the publication of The Descent of Man, a large proportion of the population fell into the category of believers in the concept of polygenism, an idea prevalent throughout the 1850s that humans were divided into separate species, all of whom were subservient to the white European male. Skull measurements and archaeological comparisons were used by men such as the anatomist Robert Knox in his The Races of Men of 1850 as evidence of the independent origins and thus stratification of the human species. For learned men of this persuasion, the concept of slavery was self-justifying. Since the earliest times, the dark races have been the slaves of their fairer brethren due to the obvious physical and mental inferiority of the Negro, he said. However, coterminous with the theory of evolution was the notion of monogenism, expounded by philosophers of science, because the word scientist hadn't yet been invented, such as Thomas Hodgkin, who founded the Ethnological Society of London in 1842. Monogenism is the tenet that all humans are unified in one single species. For Darwin, the races had diverged from a common stock as in any other animal species, and he began to explore the significance of what had previously been considered as purely aesthetic features, such as skin colour and hair texture, that polygenists were using to demarcate the different races. That all men were ultimately related regardless of creed or colour was anathema to a great many of the public who read the works of Darwin, Huxley and Galton. And even though Darwin promoted the idea that racial diversification both benefited and drove forward human progress, social Darwinism as a concept was exploited in some sectors of Victorian society to legitimate both sexism and racism. Thomas Huxley, otherwise known as Darwin's bulldog, I believe Michael is going to speak about him next month, maintained that the English themselves were of a mixed racial stock, having been previously colonized by the Romans and then the Danish and Norwegian Vikings in turn. Opposed to Huxley in this respect was Francis Galton, a younger cousin of Darwin, whose experiences exploring parts of Africa in his 20s had led him to contend that Negroes were apparently 2 grades below the white races in their natural abilities, and that a large number of Negroes were supposedly mentally deficient. Francis Galton claimed that, in contrast, the pick of the British race are strong in mind and body, truthful and purposive, excellent leaders of the people of the lower races. But where Galton differed from many of his contemporaries was that he did not categorize all non-white people as one faceless race. He recognized races in the plural. Just as there are differences between the English and the Irish, so there are differences between the Berbers and Egyptians, and the Ovambo and the Damara of Africa, as he says. Such a difference between Berbers and Egyptians, you cannot strike a Berber, but you may flog as many Egyptians and beat them with sticks as you like. They are thoroughly slavish. On the Damara peoples, there is hardly a particle of romance or affection or poetry in their character or creed, but they are a greedy, heartless, silly set of savages. And on the Ovambo, they were ugly, bony men with strongly marked features and dressed with a very funny scantiness of attire. Their heads were shaved and one front tooth was chipped out. However, Francis Galton's observations were not always comprised of such negative generalizations, for he was apparently very much impressed with Muslims for what he described as the manly conformity of their everyday actions to their creed, which he contrasted with that of Christian protestations of unworldliness on one day of the week and worldly behavior on the other 6. From these examples, we can infer that Galton's own understanding of racial differentiation took in not just physiognomy, but also different customs and religions. For it was by the making the concept of a race in the physiognomic sense coterminous with cultural production, customs and religion that Galton was able to produce such a comprehensively hierarchical and essentialized understanding of humanity. Galton's ideas were appropriated by empire novelists like H. Rider Haggard and Frederick Marryat. The role of imperialism in Victorian fiction was not just one of territorial aggrandizement, but also an ideological position, and its effects on contemporary discourses of exploration and colonialism were immense. Empire novels were generally the narratives of the colonizers, very rarely of the colonized. For many, imperialism was an evolving but pervasive set of attitudes towards the rest of the world, and these attitudes influenced many aspects of Victorian and Edwardian culture. Imperialist ideology is also interwoven with both sexism and racism, along with ideas of social class, gender, and political reform. Thomas Carlyle, Charles Dickens, Charles Kingsley, John Ruskin, and Alfred Lord Tennyson all supported jingoism, but were in turn opposed not only by Darwin and Huxley, but by liberal thinkers such as John Stuart Mill and Thomas Hughes. Thomas Hughes, of course, wrote Tom Brown's School Days in 1857, an eye-opener of a read with regards to all-boy environments and how they were used to propagate the expansion of empire through muscular Christianity. Hughes himself said that it was a real novel for boys, written in the right spirit, but distinctly aimed at being interesting. It was so successful that he went on to publish Tom Brown at Oxford in 1861. Thomas Carlyle's view was that all dark races could only progress towards civilization through white domination, and Anthony Trollope, of such novels as the Barchester Chronicles, firmly believed in the natural racial superiority of white Europeans, whose responsibility, he said, it was to import the light of civilization, thus illuminating the supposedly dark races of the world. The true appeal of imperialism lay not in the feverish pace of overseas annexations or in the tense atmosphere of international competition, but in the marked appetite of the British public for conquest, combat, and heroism. Empire was seen as a projection of masculinity. Manliness and empire confirmed one another, guaranteed one another, enhanced one another. The running, organisation, and control of empire required decidedly manly attributes such as ruthlessness, resourcefulness, and self-reliance. Empire was, in a fundamental sense, a test of the nation's virility. The discourse of conquest and colonialism was heavily male-oriented. You may have worked that out by now. It answered to profoundly masculine needs. The empire needed men, but men also needed empire as a resource, as a refuge, and as an object of desire. And of course, it was through empire and colonialism that many women found their husbands. The adventure novel prepared the way for imperial fiction, focusing on cultural figures such as the scout, the discoverer, and the warrior as part of a process of initiation. The adventure story provided a chance to explore unseen and unembarrassed fantasies of a more powerful self, regardless of whether they were achievable in reality. The male protagonists of empire novels, apart from being predominantly white, are also heroic and manly in the extreme. For authors such as Arthur Conan Doyle, there was no room for romance anywhere in the adventure novel. In fact, these novels are generally noted for their often misogynistic content, demonstrated in the works of Rider Haggard, among others. Haggard's King Solomon's Mines and She are romping good reads, but exceptionally sexist. For Conan Doyle, the search for adventure was a way back through layers of artifice and taboo to the raw edges of primitive life, the jungle, and the originary wilderness. This can most clearly be seen in his novel Lost World of 1912. This was the story of dinosaurs that inspired Michael Crichton's 20th century novel Jurassic Park, on which the movie series is based. Clearly, there is no room for effetism, for such novels celebrate the epic life, depicting adventure, heroism, and true nobility. From approximately 1830 until the 1870s, white heroes rarely doubted their ability to tame either women or natives. Such characters held out manfully against cannibals and any other dark-skinned character who found himself in some sort of partnership with the conqueror. This person was more often than not relegated to the position of sidekick. Nevertheless, the danger atavism was always present, specifically in the male protagonists symbolized by Joseph Conrad's anti-hero Kurtz, who in Heart of Darkness in 1899 becomes a white savage. Many stories in this vein are not only investigations into the dark places of Africa, the East and South America, but also of the dark places of the human psyche in barely endurable circumstances. By the end of the century, it had become necessary to establish exemplars of manly behaviour in literature because the whole romance domain, these novels were called romance novels, had become somewhat feminised. H. Rider Haggard's fiction proffered a universal ideal which was clearly unsuitable for female domestic readership. Writers such as Haggard championed a form of romance narrative that the youth of empire could aspire to, the continent of Africa becoming a space where romance and heroism can unfold. The protagonists of these novels are often deployed in order to discover and penetrate the heart of Africa as a rite of passage proving their value as English gentlemen. But it is interesting to note that while the white men in these novels hunt elephants and such for recreation, the natives hunt for food and do not kill for fun. The character of Mbopa in King Solomon's Mines belongs to what was often referred to as the noble class of savage, because he was not dependent upon the civilizing white man for progress. Along with Africa, particular attention was paid by British writers to the various regions of South Asia. Frederick Marryat's novels of the 1830s and 1840s concentrate upon the supposed inferiority of the people he referred to as the Hindus, and also the Chinese, both of whom he considered effeminate due to their short stature and lack of facial hair. Interestingly, Marryat compares these men unfavorably the Burmese, who he thought were a very powerful race, possessing great strength and energy. Like Francis Galton, Marryat seems to have differentiated between the conquered races, rather than simply to have grouped them all under the umbrella term of savages. Charles Grant, in the 1830s, described the inhabitants of Hindostan, as he named it, as degenerate and a base race of men, governed by malevolent and licentious passions. Similarly, William Wilberforce, another subject up for discussion in the next few weeks, declared all Hindu deities to be absolute monsters of lust, injustice, wickedness, and cruelty. The novels of William Makepeace Thackeray, even when set in India, display few Indian characters. Those who do appear are usually minor in significance and almost entirely silent. Indians in Victorian fiction seem to have been essentially non-characters, simply shadows without voice or substance. By way of contrast, Reginald Heber, the Bishop of Calcutta in the 1820s, travelled extensively in northern India and displayed the utmost respect for most of the people he encountered. He said, "Of the natural disposition of the Hindu, I see abundant reasons to think highly. They are constitutionally kind-hearted, industrious, sober, and peaceable. At the same time, they show themselves on proper occasions a manly and courageous people." Individual perceptions seem to have been influenced by one's position and experiences in 19th century society. Robert Louis Stevenson's character, Dr. Jekyll, has the same power-fixated proclivities as Conrad's Kurtz did, but transposed to Great Britain. Stevenson is one particular author who raises the direct question of how science and manliness are related in his sensational tale of a scientific experiment which endeavours to locate the biological source of evil within a man. Dr. Jekyll is himself a man of science, but he wishes to surpass normal science. He wants to know the difference between good and evil, to which end he is willing to experiment upon himself. Dr. Jekyll, and by proxy Robert Louis Stevenson himself, believed that man is not a unity, being not one but two, half good, half evil. Dr. Jekyll's experiments concentrate upon separating the two essential elements of man, as opposed to woman, who, according to Coventry Patmore, must remain the angel in the house. Mr. Hyde personifies the evil side of man. Dr. Jekyll signifies man as positively industrious, seeking to expand the experience of human nature as multidimensional. However, Dr. Jekyll's fallibility rests upon him remaining torn between good and evil, aghast at the result of his experiment, but tempted to continue it nonetheless. The experiment fails, but it illustrates the eagerness with which the Victorian literary establishment joined with the scientific discourses available to them, whether at home or abroad. And now for Thomas Hardy, which you knew would be inevitable. Hardy was an acclaimer of Darwin. He believed in the general principles of evolution and copied from the journal The Examiner in 1876 into one of his personal notebooks. Science tells us that in the struggle for life, the surviving organism is not necessarily that which is absolutely the best in an ideal sense, though it must be that which is most in harmony with surrounding conditions. One only has to think of Diggory then in Return of the Native. For Darwin, evolution eradicated the divide between the human and the animal. Ergo, for Hardy, humans were not in the cosmic scheme of things more important than bugs, horses, and birds that seem constant to companions. To humans, whether the humans are always aware of them or not. What made the greatest impression upon Hardy throughout his voracious reading over the decades was the awful irreversibility of the evolutionary accident that had led human beings to develop awareness of their own biological natures and mortality beneath the stars and the planets that they had so long observed. This is evident in Gabriel Oakes' discernment of the vastness of the cosmos in Far From the Madding Crowd, and Tessa's out-of-body experience while a milkmaid at Talbot Hayes Farm in Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Hardy's literary notebooks demonstrate the proliferation of his reading in such subjects as astronomy, cosmology, geology, evolutionary theory, antiquities, anthropology, mythology, and the classics. Such material reinforced for Hardy a particular prognosis of the human condition. The past is present, biologically and historically. Evolution and adaptation are an ongoing process. Adaptation and change do not imply progress. Chance and will do not imply providence or grace. Hardy was incapable of observing the world and its mindless processes without some kind of emotional reaction. Against the interpretation that Darwin's rationalization and intellectualization of the world had stripped it of meaning and value, Hardy looks with Darwinian eyes and re-enchants Victorian life in his fiction. Such ideologies are evinced by Hardy throughout his whole career. 19th century inventions that we take for granted today were greeted with skepticism by Victorians, but became ubiquitous throughout literature and art nonetheless. The camera, the telephone, the typewriter, the phonograph, the telegraph, all feature in 19th century literature. The best example of a Victorian author exploiting all of these inventions for fictional purposes is Dracula by Bram Stoker in 1897. Mina Harker uses a typewriter and consults train timetables. Dr. Seward runs a lunatic asylum and records his patient case studies on phonographic cylinders. Van Helsing reads scientific manuals, blood transfusions are performed, and the railways play a significant part in the plot of the novel. The coming of the railways, of course, had a huge impact on Victorian society, and not everyone was happy about it. Charles Dickens was not a fan of rail travel, and in his novel Dombey and Son in 1848, he portrays trains as monsters devouring everything in their path. He, of course, was a victim of the infamous Staplehurst incident, in which a train derailed off a bridge, and after making sure the manuscript he was carrying at the time was safely sequestered away with his mistress Ellen Ternan, and the passengers, providing succour where he could. And of course, the railway is the focus of Turner's masterpiece, Rain, Steam and Speed, the Great Western Railway of 1844, in which you can just make out a terrified hare darting down the track ahead of the oncoming train, symbolising the enormous impact of the encroachment of industrialisation upon society. And of course, we have the 19th century to thank for science fiction, although a very definite claim for that can be made by Leonardo da Vinci and his many futuristic inventive visions. However, H.G. Wells and Jules Verne envisioned space travel, air balloon travel, deep sea travel, the concept of the time machine and the evolution of man into distinct races, such as the Eloi and the Morlocks. Richard Jefferies was one of many who wrote of the annihilation of London and other cities due to man-made apocalypses in 1885. And of course, there were many tales of alien invasion. During the 19th century, science and the arts became inextricably linked, just as they are today. From John Keats training as a doctor before becoming a poet, to novels like The Island of Dr. Moreau in 1896, which explored genetic mutation almost a century before the discovery of DNA strands by Watson and Crick at Cambridge University. Here endeth the lesson.